if your kid is struggling in school, and especially if they're pre-med or want to become a doctor in the future, the last thing you should do is get them a tutor, and this is why. So, to preface this, I'll talk about how the difficulty of education changes as your kid progresses through their pre-med career. So I'll start off at the left end of the graph here with middle school, and then high school, college, medical school, and residency. Now, obviously, the difficulty of each of these stages is going to be significantly harder than the previous stage. And that's just the fundamental nature of how medicine works. There's so much content in medicine that builds on itself, resulting in a process where each stage of schooling is going to be significantly more volume-packed and harder to comprehend than the previous stage. And this isn't anything new. Everyone knows that medical school is way harder than college, and that college is going to be significantly harder than high school, and high school is going to be much more difficult compared to middle school. So then people still end up doing fine, right? People still end up becoming doctors and succeeding in medical school and residency. And the reason is their skill level improves. They adapt to these challenges and overcome it. No kid starts all the way up here with the mental capacity and discipline sufficient to go straight into medicine and become a doctor and start seeing patients, right? In general, kids start somewhere down here, and then as they kind of progress through this schooling process, they build the skills and discipline and habits needed to succeed. And so I was no different. My skill level probably started around here, and this is somewhat arbitrary. And it remained constant until I hit this first challenge point right here. This was the first point in which the difficulty of education exceeded my current skill level. And this was in high school. This was in 10th grade. And I was taking a course called pre-calculus. And this course was a known GPA killer at my high school. And it was the first time I'd ever gotten a B on an exam. Until then, my natural sort of, encoding and information processing skills had been sufficient for me to do well in school. Now, let's zoom in and talk about why I kind of hit a roadblock here and what skills were insufficient in my kind of repertoire that didn't allow me to succeed in pre-cal immediately. The first thing was my study skills were just poor. I never needed to develop study skills until this point because my natural kind of learning and encoding skills were sufficient. It was enough for me to go to class, just watch my teacher kind of lecture, come home, do the homework, and then show up for the exam. The second thing, which is kind of related to the first point, was my discipline was really bad. So I never could force myself to really work or study or do anything outside of what, I had strict deadlines for in class. And as a result, when I kind of started facing this higher difficulty coursework, I didn't have the kind of mental power to force myself to study more. Okay, so what should have happened in this situation? In an ideal world, I would have recognized these two issues and I would have acted accordingly. I would have found ways to improve my study skills and improve my discipline, and my skill level would have increased. And then, I probably would have been okay again until I hit my next roadblock, and I would have increased them again, so on and so forth. Or if I was a really stellar student, I would have, once I'd sufficiently increased my skill level, I would have continued transiently and slowly working on it to avoid further drops in outcome. And I would have maintained a comfortable increase in, a comfortable difference between challenge and skill level throughout my entire educational career. This would have been ideal. But now let's talk about what happens in reality. In reality, my parents saw this first B, they saw this dip in my GPA, and they got worried, and so they got me a tutor. And the really dangerous thing about tutoring is it does work. So my skill level stayed the same. However, my grades improved because my tutor filled in the difference between skill level and challenge. Now, this seems great, right? It seems like for low mental effort on my end, I managed to still get good grades. I managed to still get high results. However, especially for pre-meds, there will inevitably be a point where tutoring is no longer viable. And the reason for that is, in medicine, the type of knowledge we deal with becomes so advanced that the only people who have the skills and mastery of knowledge needed to tutor you are going to be other doctors or PhDs. And they typically have their own obligations, jobs, and commitments at the point where they cannot tutor people unless they're paid, extremely high wages or extremely high rates. And that's not realistic for most people. So what happened in this situation? Well, all of a sudden, I entered a course called Organic Chemistry 2, which any medical student can tell you is a GPA buster. This is, known across the planet. Organic chemistry is an extremely difficult part of medicine. Now, this was especially tough for me because I hadn't built these increases in study skills, let alone, this nice maintained lead. And so I had to cover this huge gap between my abilities and the challenge level I was facing. But also, the drop in outcomes I was seeing now mattered way more. So let me explain each one of those things. The first thing I said was I had to cover a larger gap, right? In a shorter period of time. What I mean by that is, if I had covered these problems back here, I would have only needed to cover a very small gap since the challenge level of high school was just beginning to exceed my natural abilities. I then, like I said earlier, could have, chilled out and then repeated this process, or I could have maintained a comfortable lead with minimal effort on my end. And I would have been able to kind of focus on other parts of, my pre-med life, like extracurriculars, passion projects, stuff like that. However, in this situation, I had to make up a much larger gap in a much smaller amount of time. So I had to dedicate a ton of time and resources that should have been spent on boosting my extracurriculars and other parts of my application into improving my basic skills needed to succeed in school itself. So that was problem number one. Problem number two was the drop in outcome in college mattered a lot more for me as a pre-med than it did in high school. So let's think about what actually happens when your child gets a low grade in high school. Worst case scenario, they're unable to get into, like a top tier Ivy League. But realistically, assuming they do improve their skill, like I've shown in this graph, they're still able to get into a very high ranked state school or even a lower tier Ivy. And especially for those on a pre-med track, that is completely insignificant. There are people who get into medical schools from, random community colleges. That's not an uncommon story. And so your performance in high school really doesn't matter that much for medicine. However, in college, this is a slightly different story. A drop in grades in college can actually impact your ability to get into a high-tier medical school, and better medical schools do end up having better match rates. In other words, getting into a better medical school can increase your chance, or your child's chance, of getting into the specific, specialty or becoming the type of doctor they want to be. So in my case, because I was spending a bunch of time and a bunch of effort fast-tracking my way to, better study skills and better discipline, I was not spending time on, first of all, other things I could have been doing, like extracurriculars and passion projects. And also, while I was doing this process, there was a drop in outcomes here, right? I was getting bad grades. There's no way around this. And that actually did end up in, damage on my application. I was unable to get top tier honors in my college, and I was unable to kind of get certain dean honors. And therefore, I didn't have something on an application that would have been otherwise easy for me to get. So instead of tutoring, let's talk about what we should actually do. We should invest in trainable skills, right? So what I mean by this is there are certain skills that you as a parent can invest in for your child. So you can put them in courses that teach study skills, and you can, do various things that instill discipline in them. And these are significantly, more important to invest in compared to tutoring, because they're not susceptible to that sudden drop that tutoring is, and they're also lifelong skills, or at least career-long skills for medicine. So the first one is study skills. And you might think that everyone knows how to study, but in reality, there's been a lot of advancement in study science over the past few years, and very few people actually know the most efficient ways to study. And I have a, link for that in the description below. And then secondly, discipline. A lot of people think discipline is something that you're born with, like you either have it or you don't. But in reality, it's going to be a combination of lifestyle stuff, mindset, and then self-reflection. And all of these things can be trained. And I know this for a fact because I invested heavily into both these skills, and they played probably one of the biggest roles in why I was able to get into medical school and succeed in medical school. So if your child is struggling, please do not immediately default to tutoring. Instead, really try to find ways to improve their study skills or their discipline, ideally both, and that will serve them much more in the long run.